I would like to just begin by telling you that I have just got back only a few hours ago from the United States of America. As you know, and there's a reason why I mentioned that. One is, of course, that I'm slightly jet-lagged and maybe a little random in my comments. But more important, I want to remind everyone that the most important issue being discussed in the United States right now is the so-called Mueller report. They're all very concerned with what they are arguing was Russian interference in the American election. So I would say that as a diplomat, from the Ministry of External Affairs, I think diplomats need to be very careful on how they do promotion of whether of democracy or of anything else, particularly now that we live in an age of social media, because the Russians are accused of having interfered using electronic means. Of course, this is a peculiar case because the Americans participate in everyone's elections one way or the other. But that they see and they call it democracy promotion. So I think these terms are quite loaded. The way these things happen, they can be manipulated, misused. So I'm with Mr. Quraishi when he says, "Jo kuch karna hai, pyar se, softly, gently." I'm not in favor of a more strident form of democracy promotion, particularly when we are talking about other countries in the world. And I think that here we have to also remember a couple of other things. One is, of course, as has been mentioned already, democracy is not doing very well these days. There are a lot of challenges being faced by countries. And of course, as a result, there's a lot of criticism. Now, for my own self, I'm very grateful that I live in a democracy where the elections are conducted so well by Dr. Quraishi and his successors. But the fact is that democracy means more than elections. And that is the reality that we must not forget. But I want to add to all the examples that Mr. Quraishi has given regarding what is done for democracy promotion. And certainly the Ministry of External Affairs, our embassies abroad, do quite a lot of work on this kind of institutional assistance and support. So apart from the assistance in the conduct of elections in many countries in our own neighborhood as well as in Africa, there is also the fact that India participates very actively in the international parliamentary unions. Parliament is a very important part of democracy. And if parliaments don't function well, then you don't actually have a democracy, even if you have had an election. Again, to go back to the United States, the big discussion right now is how the tussle between the president and the US Congress, people are criticizing it and saying it does not function anymore. We have seen it also in some of our neighboring countries where, the opposition is not able to have a voice, where they are unable often sometimes to participate in elections. So we must remember that elections are one critical element, but there are other aspects which make a democracy, and parliament is one of those. And India has actually been quite active in participating and offering training to countries that are interested to have their parliamentarians visit in India. And the election officers in many countries are trained under the ITEC program of the Ministry of External Affairs. And in fact, we have very large numbers of alumni from these training programs in all the countries that we serve in. And it's not just Africa, it's many other countries. We ourselves also participate as election observers in other countries. I, for instance, went 2 years ago to Tanzania when they had their election. Now, the election was conducted very well, but the results were just completely dismissed. I was in Zanzibar and the government at the center refused to accept the outcome, and that election was just wiped out. So we must go beyond elections. I think we have to understand that Democracy has many other factors. It requires a free press. Again, this is something we are criticized for, sometimes with what's happening to journalists in provincial parts of India. And you can see that many countries which regard themselves as democracies, and again, to go to the United States, just because I've come from there, innumerable television channels, journalists have had their White House credentials taken away by the present government. So these are all very mixed things. And I'm pointing out some of these things because I am always wary of following a Western example. You know, they have always gone about trying to improve the world with often disastrous results for the countries that they go into. And this is most recently, we can see this in our own neighborhood. You know, a number of the Western countries went to Iraq to introduce democracy. Libya, where, as you know, the UK and France started bombing even before they had got their NATO partners in. So I would say, pyar se, as Dr. Quraishi says, it is better to go softly, it is better to go slowly. Fine, then there are a couple of other points I want to make. When we are saying that we should do democracy promotion, who should we target? So these days, Turkey is coming in for a lot of criticism about how democratic institutions are being eroded. They are under attack from President Erdogan. But you know, 4 or 5 years ago, soon after the so-called Arab Spring, which are really Arab uprisings, Turkey was the example on how Muslim countries are also democracies. Bangladesh should have been an example, but it was not talked about so much, as should Malaysia, as should many of the other Southeast Asian countries, which are predominantly Muslim countries. But look at Turkey today. Yes, there has been an erosion of some institutions. But on the other hand, these are all very delicate things. Democracy itself is a process. It's an evolutionary process. And to sit in judgment and say very stridently that you will come in for promotion, I think does not work very well. We ourselves have been at the receiving end of charges being told that we are not very democratic. This is what's going to happen if this doesn't happen to you, if that doesn't happen. So what are the instruments that have been used against India and that are being used against others as well in the course of the evolution of our democracies? One, of course, is persuasion, where you go and you say something and you offer these kinds of training facilities. Usually this works quite well. The other is sanctions. You know, sanctions being imposed on countries which are supposedly not democratic, but in fact, this is a pursuit of interests. That is the judgment that has to be made, and some kind of balance between the promotion of values and the fact that there are interests as well. I think more often when countries are sanctioned, it is a pursuit of interests rather than the promotion of democracy. Iraq was sanctioned for decades. You know, Iran has been under sanctions for more than 40 years now. Has that promoted democracy? I think these are serious questions. And then, of course, there is the use of force, or at least the threat of use of force against countries which are deemed not democratic. I think these are all ways and things where we have to be quite careful when we get into how we want to promote the concept of democracy. And again, one has to agree with Dr. Quraishi when he says that example is the best way to do this. The fact that our elections are conducted on this scale with these difficulties has attracted other countries to come to India to learn how we do this. And our offers of training have been very well received. So I want to just tell you that, you know, there are many countries in which we have actually helped in conducting elections in very difficult circumstances. In my own experience, I was ambassador in Côte d'Ivoire where I was based, but I was also accredited to Sierra Leone, which was just coming out of its civil war. In fact, there was still a UN peacekeeping force there. And India was one of the countries that provided a lot of assistance in terms of training election officers, providing the EVMs with which the election was conducted, and helping to carry out the whole process. Now, do we receive a lot of recognition and noise on that count? No. Even Sierra Leone may have forgotten about the assistance that was given. But that does not mean that other countries in West Africa, where I served, have not continued to reach out to us for assistance, for electoral assistance, participation in the training programs for parliamentary functioning, and other forms as well, including sending their journalists to India very often. So my sense is that if we can carefully balance between what will be critiqued as interference in the internal affairs, which we ourselves have claimed when we have been pressurized by countries that used to give aid. And some of my colleagues will recall that eventually we terminated receiving aid from many of these countries, which would give small amounts of aid, but had a lot to say on what India should do and what was going wrong with India and how India was, in breach of all manner of good governance. We must remember our own experience. We must remember how we reacted, how we would react even today, even though the Indian democracy, like democracy in other countries, is a work in progress. There is much that can be faulted, even as we praise what is worthwhile. And it's important, particularly in my experience, for diplomats to always keep that in mind. And I will just mention one experience, and maybe some of my other colleagues will fill you in with more details, particularly Dr. Quraishi. And that was when we, with Nepal, when Nepal announced a new constitution, the provisions for which were actually very discriminatory, that was our understanding, against the Madheshi population, that is the plains Nepalis. We made an effort and we spoke to the government. I was going to say lobbying, which is one of the other great problems of democracies, but that is for another day. And the government was not receptive. And then, as everyone knows, there was a blockade. It was not a blockade which the Government of India or Ministry of External Affairs actually put in place. There were threats of stoning, so truckers were themselves hesitant to go in there. But whatever the details of this matter, it was perceived as a very hostile act in Nepal, and it has continued to impact our relationship negatively, despite the fact that India was the first responder when they had that massive earthquake and aid was provided immediately. So I think negatives have a longer life than positives. So let us be careful and move with pyar, as Dr. Quraishi has told us. Thank you very much.
I'll start off by making 4 basic observations about democracy as I see it, and then just go in a little bit as how I see India has been going about the promotion of democracy, and finally leave you with some thoughts as to what more India can do. So just 4 basic observations. First, to add to what Ambassador Neelam there said, democracy is about more than elections. And in fact, a lot of the literature on democracy focuses broadly on three things, and then, of course, institutions to implement this. One is inclusive participation in the political process. That is fundamentally important before people go out to vote. A second is an enlightened understanding of the issues at stake. And the knowledge of citizens is fundamentally important. And equal voting in the equal voter participation, finally, is the third element of what makes for a successful democracy. And what we're seeing in some ways, and I'll start off with this observation, is while, whether it's in India or in other countries, while the voting processes have been improved to a great degree, it's harder today, not impossible, but harder to rig elections in this day and age. The first two are really where democracy is undermined. So to repeat, it's the inclusive participation of all citizens in the political process and understanding of the electorate. So that's my first observation. The second, to paraphrase Jane Austen, it's a truth universally acknowledged that a rising power in search of a peaceful international environment must be in want of regimes in its neighborhood that reflect its own values. So we see in some ways a United States, only after it became a major power, starting to influence what other governments look like. We're starting to see this a little bit with China, most notably in Hong Kong, and that's led to questions even in places like Taiwan about what kind of political processes it wants. Will a rising China start to reflect Chinese values abroad? And so it's only natural that a rising India will be asked or will debate and deliberate what kind of values we would like to see beyond our borders. The third observation I'd make is that in the long run, the choice between values and interests is a false binary. It's a false choice. In the long run, values are always interests. That does not mean that in the short run, trade-offs have to be made. In fact, they're made on a day-to-day basis, and this is what complicates things. But in the long run, a values-based agenda will, of course, coincide increasingly with an interest-based agenda. And my final observation is that a country is on treacherous ground, any country, when it starts believing its own propaganda. And we saw this a little bit play out in the disparity during the Cold War on non-alignment in terms of the rhetoric and the practice. Non-alignment in practice did not mean that India could not align with the Soviet Union when it was in its interests, or work with the West when it was in its interests. Similarly, I was in a discussion recently with a young Indian diplomat who said it is India's policy that it does not interfere in the affairs of other countries, and I had to ask her very gently if she had spoken to a Nepali or a Sri Lankan or a Bangladeshi, because there's a lot of evidence of India interfering in these countries. And it's not only India, by the way. The US does this as well. There's a popular belief in US policy circles that stopping genocide is in the US national interest. And I often ask my American friends, how many times has the US actually done that? And the answer is once only, in the Balkans. It didn't stop in Rwanda. It didn't stop genocide in Rwanda. It didn't stop in Bangladesh. It didn't stop in Cambodia. It didn't even stop it in Germany. So there is a sense sometimes that we fall victim to our own propaganda. And so this idea that, I know it makes a nice talking point, but India is proud of its own democracy but does not promote democracy overseas, I think should be subjected to a great deal of scrutiny. And again, I think the historical record does show India playing a quite active role. It started, in fact, with India being at the vanguard of decolonization. And decolonization was in some ways the first step towards establishing democracies around the world. India helped not only rhetorically and ideologically, but in very material terms, including in military terms, in places like Burma, in Indonesia, this in the late 1940s, when India itself was a newly independent country, in the Congo in 1960, where India actually sent troops and Indian soldiers lost their lives. The first Paramveer Chakra ever awarded to an Indian for overseas activity was in Congo in 1960. In Ghana, where India helped set up some of the institutions after Ghana became independent, even in Rhodesia in southern Africa. So we see even in the early years of the Cold War, India being, again, not just the rhetoric, which was nice, but also providing material support in many ways. In the second half of the Cold War, India actually stuck its, this is again an era that is, in popular belief, India became more hard-nosed, realist, isolationist. But again, India stuck its neck out in many ways. Bangladesh being a very notable example, where India justified its intervention in East Pakistan on the grounds of human rights and democracy. We forget that what triggered that was, in fact, a vote that was not recognized, an election in 1970 in Pakistan. The fact that in that instance values and interests aligned made it, of course, an easier decision to make. But other decisions were not as easy. South Africa being an example. India stuck its neck out and boycotted apartheid South Africa. I don't know how many tennis fans there are here, but India made the final of the Davis Cup in the 1970s, and when it was drawn against South Africa, Indian players refused to participate, and the international tennis community, in fact, did not side with India on that. It handed the Davis Cup over to South Africa. We forget even in other instances where India intervened to support democracy. Sri Lanka, where many mistakes were made and the outcome was certainly not a desirable one, but India initially intervened to support a ceasefire agreement. The Indian peacekeeping force was precisely that. The fact that it got drawn into a civil war, I think, was a result of other decisions made after and miscalculations made after the fact. In the 1980s, India sent a gunboat to the Seychelles to prevent a coup there. So there is, again, a history of India using sometimes military force, but other means as well, to support democracy, even during this period. More recently, I think the success cases, and other speakers, including Shakti Sinha, will elaborate on this. I think there have been more cases as India's neighborhood has democratized. And for the first time, barring China, all of India's neighbors have an elected leader, a democratically elected leader. And this is leading to new kinds of challenges as well in India's relations with these countries, Nepal being a prime example. But you also see, in some ways, India supporting these activities. India has been one of the largest aid providers to Afghanistan. It's involved in actual elements of state building. You see this in Sri Lanka and the Maldives in the last few years, where India, again, these are easy cases because Indian interests and values have aligned in these cases. You see this in terms of quietly supporting the democratic processes that led to changes in Myanmar and more recently in Bhutan. And even Pakistan, where India has consistently resisted attempts at trying to undermine a civilian elected government by engaging directly with the military. A few years ago, for example, India boycotted a conference that was an international conference that was giving support was promoting effectively the Pakistani military over the civilian government. And India felt that this was undermining at that time its engagement efforts with the Pakistani civilian government. Finally, I would touch upon norms that India has been supporting. And this, again, is subject to debate even internally in India. These are not fixed. But in terms of connectivity, where India has emphasized the human sustainability element of connectivity, that this should not just be about major infrastructure projects, shiny airports that benefit a political leader and his constituency, but are actually sustainable, again, from an environmental perspective, but also from a human and economic perspective. Whether it is on a multi-stakeholder model for internet governance, which gives a role to civil society in the governance of the internet, or whether it's a more people-centric approach to climate change as well. And in all of these cases, you see India actually promoting norms that are not just norms from a ideal liberal point of view, but are also supportive of people. And these are in some ways reflections of India's own experience. Now, what do we do now? I'll leave you with this. One, I think India is already doing a lot. I think its record speaks for itself. It may have to do a better job of articulating this. Because many of these efforts, as I mentioned, and what other panelists will have mentioned, are not necessarily known even within India, let alone outside of India. Second, I would caution against military intervention as the only tool. Sometimes democracy promotion has become associated, for better and for worse, with the use of military force. And while that sometimes may be necessary, and I think, again, I mentioned a few examples where India has applied it, in other cases it is, and again, going by India's own experience, hasn't gone so well. And again, the record, as Ambassador Deo rightly pointed out, of other countries using military force to promote democracy is certainly not without blemishes. But that being said, I'll leave you with four thoughts as to what India can do to better promote democracy. And just as a premise to that, I would say that the challenges facing democracy, both within India and outside of India, are really what I have described as the 4 I's, which are identity, inequality, information, and interference. And to different degrees, these are all undermining just to go back to the start of my presentation, the first 2 elements of what is necessary for a successful democracy, which is effective participation of all in political processes and our understanding and knowledge. So just to very briefly go over that, identity is becoming a challenge, how to deal with a pluralistic society in a democratic framework. This is something that every country from the US to France to Australia to across Africa, Southeast Asia, India as well is contending with. Inequality, particularly the perception of lack of inequality of opportunity, is adding to populism. We see this when the merger of economic populism and identity-based politics is emerging in places, again, particularly Europe and the US we're seeing now, but it's also happening in other developing democracies as well. A third being information, or rather misinformation, and how this is undermining, again, our voters' understanding of issues. There's just been a few incidents in the news just in the last day or 2 in India, which I think underscore this problem. And finally, foreign interference, what that might look like. And again, India has been relatively immune to that issue for a number of reasons, but including the very good work done by the Election Commission. But other countries have certainly faced this. And again, not just in the West, in Indonesia recently, there were also accusations of foreign interference. So what can be done about this? I think one is, I think a greater discussion is required on what are the principles of pluralism. In many ways, pluralism is a very important value at the heart of Indian democracy. What that looks like is, I think India can be a good model for most of the developing world, and actually, frankly, increasingly the developed world as well. The second, how are the ways of preempting economic populism? There is a lot of criticism, justifiably, about voter handouts and in the run-up to an election. But again, as we deal with increasing inequalities, or certainly the perceptions of inequality, what are principles that can be adopted for that? The third, I think there's a lot that can be learned from the Indian experience of protecting our own sovereignty from foreign interference. And here it's not only what, India is a democracy, it is an open society, it makes it vulnerable in some ways to foreign interference of different kinds, but what are ways of hardening the Indian system to that. And again, I think India has done a relatively good job compared to other countries, which are now having, particularly countries like Australia, Singapore, in some ways, are having very active debates about degrees of foreign interference. But I think many can learn from India's own experience, not just in terms of hardening the electoral process, but also other institutions that could change information. One area of concern, I think, on the Indian front is opacity in electoral funding. Where I think in that instance, financial interference is something that we could learn more from other countries. And finally, I think India will be at the forefront of battling the idea of fake news at home. And India's experiences, in fact, will be a lodestar for much of the rest of the world in terms of how India confronts this. So again, just to leave you with those thoughts, these, as I see it, are the major challenges facing democracy, less the electoral processes, I think, again, because of the very good work that India has done. But in many of these cases, because of India's own democratic experience, other countries will be looking to India for what it has done right and what it has done less right. Thank you.
Thank you, Dhruva. I think
I agree with a lot of what you have said, but on some points, I would challenge the narrative that has been put up here. One, of course, is that, and I begin with that, do we, and when I say we, I don't mean India as a whole, I really mean the English-speaking metropolitan elite, so to say. Do we really adequately appreciate democracy? Or is there a fair amount of discomfort with democracy? Now, we love democracy because of what it gives us. What we don't like about democracy is actually the process behind which we get what we get, which is the political process. We are extremely uncomfortable with politics, extremely uncomfortable with electoral politics. We find politicians dirty, corrupt, messy, short-sighted, thinking about themselves. And yet when I look back on the 60s and growing up in India, when the day a child was born, let me be frank, a male child was born, maybe not so in Maharashtra, the first thing the father did was to book a Vespa scooter. Because by the time the boy grew up to go to college or get a job, the Vespa scooter would be delivered. Later, of course, Vespa became Bajaj, and Bajaj brought a Bajaj Chetak for those who had foreign relatives who could pay in dollars. Then the waiting period was not 18 years, but just 3 years. Right? You had one single watch, HMT Citizen, which had a waiting period. There was no question of telephones at home. No questions of telephones at home. So anybody tells you that the 60s were great years, I'm sorry. 60s were not the great years. They were horrible years. So, but the political process which has delivered this makes us very uncomfortable. And therefore, on one hand, we love democracy, and I must give credit there, thanks to the efforts made, as Dr. Quraishi pointed out. On Facebook today, on Delhi, 12th of May, there'll be tens of thousands of fellows, women, with their photographs of, I have voted. This did not happen in the past. So in one sense, that embrace is good. It's not uniform. Mumbai and Bangalore are two outliers who refuse to vote. The second aspect is that, pointed out, we have a very prickly sense of sovereignty. It was hard won. It took a long time. We got a lot of lectures throughout. We still get them. We dislike it intensely. And therefore, when asked to speak on democracy, we are uncomfortable speaking on democracy as if it's an imposition. Now, I think we need not be defensive about it for two reasons. One, of course, is that we love foreign validation. The moment an author gets published abroad, does well abroad, we all pick up the books, not otherwise. So we love foreign validation on one hand. But more seriously, the fact we need not be worried about our record. Yes, we have lots of blemishes, lots and lots of blemishes. Our democracy is incomplete. It is work in progress. It has its ups and downs. But it's not always down. It has tremendous ups also. Again, going back to the 60s, when I look back at the communal riots of Ranchi, of Jabalpur, of Jaipur, of Ahmedabad, they're all 67 to 69. Please don't tell me that things are bad. Of course things are bad, but things have never been great. The fact is, democracies in a country of India's size and diversity, Dr. Quraishi again pointed out the linguistic and the multi-religious, every which way. You have a tribal conflict going on there, you have an insurgent somewhere else. In all that, to be able to still function, I think is a great job. So in that sense, we need not be so worried about our record. We need not be so worried that each time we open our mouth about democracy, somebody will say, what about Kashmir? What about it? We should be prepared to acknowledge it, So in that sense, when you're prepared to do that, you really strengthen democratic forces. Because it is in your interest, by and large, for the world to be more democratic, for your neighborhood to be more democratic. I spent some years in Afghanistan, 2006 to 2009, working for the United Nations on governance and development support, basically coordinating donor support. Part of the process which wrote the National Development Strategy is called the ANDS, Afghanistan National Development Strategy. And whenever we went to these meetings to talk about things, mostly the Afghans would tell me, please speak to us as an Indian, don't speak to us as a UN official. The UN was paying my salary, but the point they were making is 47 among the countries which emerged out of United India, you were the worst off. Everybody said India is doomed, Pakistan will do well. Reality, we know what has happened. Afghanistan said we were better off in 47. How have you made a success of democracy and economically, where you're seen as the world's leading? So, suddenly it strikes you that people are looking up to you in a very positive manner. And while looking up to you for what you are. So, yes, we should not be prescriptive about democracy. Don't tell people how to do things. That is not our job. I mean, it's up to each society, their native genius, to work out what is best for them. But we have to draw a distinction between defending sovereignty, which is important, but defending sovereignty is not always promoting democracy. Propping up dictators with your naval ships, to me, sorry, is not democracy. What you did in Maldives, you propped up Gayoom, who would have lost out in 88 by coup d'etat. Coup is a bad thing to happen, I agree, but you're propping up one dictator. You were not propping up democracy. So, status quo is fine up to a point. Defending the status quo all the time is not good for you. We feel that the world is unjust. We feel that the world is dominated by some people. We hope to be on the global high table someday, but we hope to do it incrementally through a process of negotiation and change, and not militarily. So a military imposition of any idea is a bad thing to begin with. It need not even be, in that sense, defended at all. But that's not the only way to do so. And therefore, working in Afghanistan and helping develop the sub-national governance strategy. And it was a very, very tedious exercise, which is a good thing, because it involved lots of people across the country. And the one thing that came out again and again, which made me appreciate India more, which I now use it, is the fact how over 70 years our federal structure has changed tremendously. The word federalism does not appear in the Indian Constitution. We call ourselves a union of states. Parliament can, by a simple resolution, abolish a state, create a state, change state boundaries legally. Practically, can Parliament just pass a resolution? No. Telangana took from 1970 to 2014 to become a state. My homeland of Gorkhaland is yet to become a state. It will never become a state. The fact is that democratic processes have evolved. We wanted linguistic states in 1924. It was the Nagpur conference, I'm not very sure now. The Motilal Nehru Sapru Committee report also talked about linguistic states. And yet when we became free, we had massive communal riots, 1.5 to 2 million people died, 10 million people each way moved across the borders. You had to integrate 565 princely states. And then war broke out in Kashmir. Both Nehru and Patel said no to linguistic states. India will break up if we are linguistic states. Potoshe Malu decided otherwise, sat on a hunger strike, died. Nehru was forced to concede linguistic states. The slow process of state making, the Samyukta Maharashtra agitation, you go across the country, Punjabi Suba agitation, we slowly remade our country. So you have Sikkim at 8 lakh people a state, you have UP at 220 million people a state. You have no legal basis for a state. People ask me when I speak out of India, so what makes for a state? Is it size? Is it population? Is it this? I said none of the above. It's democratic. And therefore, how did Meghalaya become a state? How did the Mizo district become a Mizo UT to a state? Naga district to Naga state in 64. If you look at this entire process happening, first linguistics, then on ethnic grounds, then on development grounds, then on historical grounds, Goa becoming a state, then on ground that Sikkim became a part of India. So we evolved continuously. And now I've been working with different places. I spent some time in Somalia and Mogadishu, working with the Federal and Boundary Commission. Right now, we have initiated a program in Myanmar with the Myanmar government and Ministry of External Affairs, the embassy, whereby now we go on experience sharing. We go and explain our processes. How did MNF from an insurgency become a political party? So Lal Denga, who was a government servant, an Indian citizen, becomes an insurgent, becomes the head of his government in exile kind of a thing, becomes the chief minister, dies and is buried with the Indian flag. How did this happen? So we talk about conflict resolution, we talk about our failures. And they keep asking us, so tell us what to do. I say, sorry, we cannot tell you what to do. All we can do is we can share our experiences. You see what works for you. You see what is relevant to you. In fact, I'm again in Myanmar in 3 days' time on Tuesday, speaking on our education change from 47 to now. Again, the growth of federal impulse, the problems with it, the successes with it, and how in such a large situation do you manage? Myanmar is trying to federalize. They don't know how to do it. So, it's a learning experience for them. And I think now Government of India, in its own way, is moving. The first steps are very good, helping on the electoral processes. Because if we have built up such a credible election system, it is good to share this experience with others. I think that is a very, very positive thing. Second, we've also done very good thing is the Institute of Parliament Studies. I don't know what it's called now, part of the Parliament. Niranjan, what is it called? Parliament House mein jo hai? No, in Parliament, we have this Institute for Parliamentary Studies, where it runs these orientation courses for parliamentarians and legislators. They do an excellent job with working with parliamentarians from, say, Afghanistan and other places to help how parliaments work, and an important part. Then we are helping with developing governance institutions. Again, to quote Afghanistan, I was able to persuade our embassy and the MEA that it's time we got out of a bilateral mode and work on a larger platform. So we created a program where we sent civil servants from India. Government of India has a program called iTech, where they send experts outside and pay them $2,000 or $3,000, which looks good in India, but the moment you go abroad and you see other salaries, it feels very small. When you see the next expert getting $10,000 and you're getting $2,000, it is galling. So we said, you give your $2,000. With UNDP and other donors, add another $3,000. Give them $5,000, which is very good in Kabul. So we sent in lots of Indians to go there for 6 months to a year to work in their ministries, different ministries, to develop their internal capacities. So there's a lot to be done in. Slowly, I think we are accepting the fact that promoting democratic institutions, not democracy as a vague idea. Neither democracy nor federalism is anything fixed. Both are continuously work in progress. Both are, processes and moving along. They are not a milestone. They are not a goalpost to be reached. And therefore, if you do these kind of exercises, which we have started for the last many years, but do it more openly, be prepared to stand up and say, yes, we are a democracy, and yes, we think the democratic method of governance nationally and internationally is good for all of us. I think we'll be, to my mind at least, we should be more comfortable in our own skin and not always feel very prickly about what will others say. Thank you very much.
World's largest democracy. By fourth, I was taught that democracy is rule of the people, for the people, by the people. While I was listening to the other panelists, I was wondering whether I had misunderstood what democracy is. Because basically we are focusing on elections. Therefore I said, let me look up again, Google is the best expert. And that had a very interesting proposition. It said democracy is system of government by the whole population or all the eligible members of a state by rule through elected representatives. The rule has changed from being that of an individual citizen to that of elected representatives, and this is a sleight of hand which I had not realized has occurred. The concept of sovereignty of a monarch was what the world started with. It took us a few thousand years to evolve into the system where we said sovereignty belongs to each individual citizen. And I get the feeling that now we are regressing and saying sovereignty belongs to the rulers. Across the length and breadth of this nation, I have been to various audiences, workshops, and asked people if they really believe this is rule of the people, if it is their rule. In Hindi, we use the word Lokshahi, which can only mean one thing, logon ki shahanshahi. And across the nation, nobody believes he or she, an average citizen, doesn't feel like a Badshah or Begum of this nation. So, before we think in terms of educating and spreading democracy, let's also take a look internally. Are we really a democracy? Is this rule of the people, for the people, by the people? Some people tell me, Mr. Gandhi, this is an ideal, a utopia that you are talking of. In practice, it can't happen. Let me give you a very simple example. In most Western democracies, if a citizen needs any information from the government or has applied for something and wants to know the status of his application or complaint or whatever representation, 99% he will pick up a telephone and ask. And most probably, you'll get a perfectly rational answer from the other side of the telephone. Because a human voice calls. In India, again, at various audiences, I've asked people if they'd use the telephone, and the answer is no. And I asked them, why? You don't have a telephone. Everybody has a telephone today. I mean, not everybody, but a very significant number of population has telephones. But they're so sure that either nobody will pick up the telephone, and if somebody does pick up the telephone, he will not get a response to that. He will be told, who the hell do you think you are? तुम कोई minister हो, collector हो? इधर आके पूछो, and वहां जाके पूछेंगे तब भी शायद 50% chance है कि जवाब मिलेगा, नहीं तो नहीं मिलेगा. That, I would submit, is the key of a democracy. If we do not reach there, we are not democratic. Elections, yes, are necessary condition for democracy. I would submit that elections and a constitution are necessary conditions for a democracy, but do not make a democracy. These are necessary conditions, no doubt about it. Yes, India has perhaps one of the best systems of elections, voting, change of government, which many other countries are not able to manage. We have been able to change governments and leaders in a very proper, organized manner. Our elections are a fairly reasonably fair set of elections. I can't dispute that. But after that, for the next 5 years, is the citizen the sovereign? The answer is no. And let me give you just a few examples. Is it very difficult? Some people tell me, Mr. Gandhi, you know, the affluent countries can afford to have a person on the phone answering. If the affluent countries can, in India, I believe providing employment should be one of the priorities of the government, and if the government cannot respond, it fails. Democracy fails. Just give you one example. There is a law in Maharashtra, and I believe in most other states, which says all files must be cleared within 45 days by a department, and if more than one department is concerned, 90 days. That's the limit. And disciplinary action must be taken if this is not done. Not followed by the Maharashtra government at all. Not followed by most places at all. My Supreme Court declares loftily that right to speedy justice is a fundamental right of citizens, violated every day in every court of my nation. What kind of a democracy is this? I would submit, if we have that small telephone test of democracy, where a citizen calls and gets a response, the response may not necessarily be what he likes. He writes a letter. DOPT has an office memorandum which says, letters from citizens and parliamentarians must be responded within 15 days. We just write these things, don't believe in it. Is this a rule of law? I would submit putting the citizen as the focus is what is extremely important. And why is this not happening? Because politicians are bad, bureaucrats are bad? The answer is no. The answer is we have not made our institutions viable properly. We have a Human Rights Commission, we have a Children's Commission, Election Commission, Information Commission, and so on. We have a plethora of these. I believe we have over 1,500 such commissioners. How are they selected? By a completely arbitrary process. There is no process. Forget arbitrary process. I'm using the wrong term. There is no process of selection. It is largely political patronage or bureaucratic networking. We do get a few outstanding commissioners like Dr. Quraishi. These are exceptions, sir. But the process is missing. And by that process, whatever comes, there's no accountability. We have a Lok Ayukt in Maharashtra, for example, since 1970 with a staff of 85 people. I can bet nobody here knows what the Lok Ayukt in Maharashtra does. It's confidential. The right to information held out a great hope of putting power into the hands of the individual citizen. When I meet people from the Western countries and talk about RTI in India and tell them that we have about 8 to 10 million RTI applications each year, and most of the applications are by individual citizens, not by corporates and media, as is the case in those nations. They are amazed. What a great democracy. The truth, my friends, is in those countries they use the phone. My Indian citizen uses right to information application. And even then he may or may not get information. The Supreme Court of India declares in 2011 that RTI should not be allowed to damage the peace, harmony, and integrity of India. And we keep quiet, we laugh at this. Realizing that the individual citizen is important is extremely important. And unless we do that, we can do it by a transparent process of selection of all these commissioners of various kinds. We can do it by holding them to account. Whether it's information commissioner or anyone else, do they deliver in time? Timeliness is extremely important. All human beings have finite lives. We are not immortal. Therefore, things which, and the Election Commission is one institution that does things in time. Why can't the others follow it? The judiciary says no, the Information Commission say no, police complaints authorities say no. We can't deliver in time. That is for lowly minions. The only body who really does deliver on time is the Election Commission. And I'm not saying that just because Dr. Quraishi is here, but yet. And the fact, sir, that including election commissioners, there is no process is a fact. There is no process in place. Some governments may play politics a little more than the others, but the truth is, in the last 70 years, we've not built institutions. We need to build these institutions of democracy. Should we export democracy? Yes, we should. At least in terms of elections and change of governments, we've got an outstanding record. While we are doing that, let us strengthen our own democracy. And my guess is, when we try and teach others about democracy, we will start becoming aware of our own pitfalls, of our own shortages. And maybe India will become a better democracy. When it does, it will serve the sovereignty of one individual citizen. That is the day that we have democracy. Thank you, friends.
Exposition and very frank, free-flowing kind of, sharing of, thoughts by someone who has worked within those institutional terrain and seen from inside how information commission works and what are the constraints and how does it navigate in, in the power corridors with different institutions which are also trying to act to deny informations. And then the last word Mr. Gandhi said about that we need to build institutions and probably go for, sort of, leave that attitude of, that shying away of talking to others about our democracy and, providing support. Let others also point out. In that sense, we'll also do, the course correction will be much faster because you'll also be knowing what others think about your own internal democratic challenges. And that's precisely that's the background in which actually we are talking about these issues. That time has come that we need not actually feel shy all the time that that we have human rights issues, we have challenges like insurgency or denial of human rights in many parts where different groups do not find that kind of access, or many ways there have been sort of a violation of their rights. And our democratic credentials are not that great to advertise. While this is the case, the speakers clearly brought out that there is ample opportunity, ample scope to also India can actually go more proactively and do much more than what it is doing. It's already doing a lot, but it can actually do, given the kind of ambition, given the kind of size of this country, and our ambition to be part of the global high power table and to be a leading power in terms of changing the global governance structure and have a definite voice as a sort of country from the global south. We need to also do more on some of these things like democracy or strengthening institutions, or even providing support like electoral management and many other things to strengthen institutions. So those aspects these are our strength. And on that, I think we should, probably time has come to be much more open. But while we actually, we have said all what we actually think is feasible and, something that sounds really relevant in the current time, I think a lot of you in the audience who have been, active participant of the democracy, and some of those who have come from the other countries as, officials and observers and seeing how India's democracy function. It would be very, very useful, if you can intervene and raise your questions or observations, but try to, limit it, make it as short and as straightforward as possible. And if you also want to address any of the panel, you also please take the name. And also please introduce yourself.